She stood backstage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, golden statue in hand, mascara smudging beneath her eyes, not from joy, but from something far more complicated. The applause still roared beyond the curtain, thousands celebrating her triumph, while in her purse, folded small and urgent, lay a note scribbled in her daughter's unsteady handwriting, "Mommy, when are you coming home?" It was March 29, 1983, and Meryl Streep had just won her second Academy Award, but the only thing she could think about was the babysitter's phone number and whether her son had stopped crying after she left. The world saw victory. She felt division. This is the story of what it cost, the price of perfection that nobody talks about, the weight of gold that feels heavier than any mother should have to carry. By 1983, Meryl Streep had already done what most actors only dream of achieving in a lifetime. She was 33 years old, a mother of 3 young children, and widely regarded as the finest actress of her generation. Her first Oscar had come in 1980 for Kramer vs. Kramer, a film about divorce and motherhood that had required her to excavate painful emotional territory while she herself was newly pregnant. The recognition had been swift and overwhelming. Hollywood loved her. Critics worshipped her. But something about that first win had felt incomplete to Meryl, like praise for a performance she had given while standing outside her own life, watching herself play the role of a woman she was only beginning to understand. Now, 3 years later, she had been nominated again for Sophie's Choice, a role so demanding, so spiritually exhausting, that she later admitted she wasn't sure she would ever fully recover from it. Playing Sophie Zostowski meant inhabiting a mother forced to choose which of her children would live and which would die in a Nazi concentration camp. It meant learning Polish and German fluently. It meant losing weight until her collarbone jutted sharp beneath her skin. It meant crying real tears, night after night, take after take, until the boundary between Meryl and Sophie became dangerously thin. And she did all of this while her own children were still learning to walk, still calling for her in the night, still needing her in ways that a film set could never understand. Her husband, Don Gummer, was a sculptor, a quiet, steady man who had married Meryl in 1978, just months after the death of her first great love, actor John Cazale. Don understood art. He understood solitude. He understood that Meryl needed to disappear into her work in order to feel whole. But he did not fully understand, not yet, what it meant to be married to a woman the world would not let go of. During the filming of Sophie's Choice, their home in Tribeca became a strange liminal space where two realities collided. Meryl would arrive through the door after 14-hour shooting days, still carrying Sophie's grief in her shoulders, and find her children waiting, small hands reaching, voices calling, "Mama, Mama," and she would have to shake the character off like a ghost clinging to her skin. Some nights, she couldn't. Some nights, Dawn would find her sitting on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, still in costume, unable to remember who she was supposed to be. The makeup would be half removed, revealing the real woman beneath the performance, but even Meryl wasn't sure anymore where the line between them existed. Her daughter Mamie, only 3 years old at the time, had started having nightmares. Her son Henry, barely 2, would cry inconsolably when Meryl left for work each morning, as if he somehow understood that the woman who returned each evening was not quite the same person who had kissed him goodbye. "I can't keep doing this," she told Dawn once, late at night, after their youngest had finally fallen asleep. They were sitting in the kitchen, the apartment silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic below. "I can't be her and be me. I can't be Sophie and be their mother. Something has to give, and I'm terrified of what it's going to be." Don, ever patient, had simply held her, his sculptor's hands rough and warm against her back. "Then don't," he said quietly. "Choose. You're allowed to choose." But that was the problem. Meryl Streep had never been good at choosing. Her entire life had been defined by the refusal to accept limitations, by the belief that with enough discipline, enough talent, enough willpower, she could be everything to everyone. She could be the perfect actress and the perfect mother. She could give Oscar-worthy performances and never miss a bedtime story. She could have it all, because women like her, educated, privileged, talented, were supposed to be able to have it all. Except she was starting to realize that having it all actually meant doing it all, and doing it all meant slowly disappearing under the weight of impossible expectations. The morning of the Academy Award ceremony, Meryl woke at 5:30 to the sound of her daughter crying in the next room. Mamie was 4 years old now, old enough to sense when her mother was about to leave again, young enough to believe that crying might make her stay. Meryl lay in bed for a moment, listening to the sound, feeling the familiar pull of guilt in her chest. Dawn stirred beside her, reached out to touch her shoulder, but said nothing. They both knew where this was going. She got up and padded down the hallway in bare feet, pushed open Mamie's door, and found her daughter sitting up in bed, small face wet with tears, clutching her stuffed rabbit like a life preserver. Meryl sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Mamie into her lap, stroking her hair, whispering the same promises she had whispered 100 times before. "I'll be home soon, sweetheart. Just a few hours. Just for tonight." Mamie looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too knowing for a 4-year-old. "But what if you win?" It was such a simple question. Such an impossible question. Because winning meant everything in Hollywood: validation, power, opportunity, legacy. But winning also meant interviews that stretched past midnight, after-parties that lasted until dawn, obligations that multiplied like cells dividing. Winning meant the world would want more of her, and there would be less of her left for the people who needed her most. "Then I'll still come home," Meryl said, though even as she spoke, she felt the lie in it. She could hear how hollow her own voice sounded, how unconvincing. Mamie reached up and touched her mother's face with small, serious fingers. "You always leave when you're happy," she said, and the observation landed like a stone in Meryl's stomach. It was true. Every triumph, every success, every moment of professional joy had been followed by absence. When she won her first Oscar, she had gone straight from the ceremony to a champagne-soaked party at Spago, and hadn't made it home until her children were already at school the next day. When Sophie's Choice premiered to rave reviews, she had spent 2 weeks doing press junkets across 3 continents. Her career was built on a foundation of missed moments: birthday parties attended by nannies, school plays watched from a phone call backstage, goodnight kisses delivered through doorways as she rushed out into waiting cars. Meryl felt something crack inside her chest, a small fracture that had been forming for years finally splitting open. She kissed Mamie's forehead and stood, smoothing down her robe, forcing a smile that felt like putting on a mask. "That's not true, baby. I'm happiest when I'm here with you. You know that." But as she walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, she wondered if Mamie could tell she was acting. She wondered if her children would grow up able to distinguish between their mother's real emotions and her performed ones, or if the line had already blurred beyond recognition. The ceremony itself was a blur of lights and faces and carefully orchestrated moments. Meryl sat beside Dawn in the audience, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face composed into the serene mask the cameras expected. She had done her hair and makeup, put on a beautiful gown, smiled for the photographers on the red carpet. She had played the part of a woman thrilled to be there, honored by the nomination, grateful for the recognition. And it wasn't entirely a performance, she was grateful. She was honored. But she was also exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with the slow erosion of self that came from living multiple lives simultaneously. When her category was announced, she felt her heartbeat slow rather than quicken, a strange calm settling over her like a sheet pulled over a body. She heard Jack Lemmon open the envelope. She heard him say her name, Meryl Streep, Sophie's Choice, and the applause rose around her like a wave, thousands of people standing, celebrating her achievement. She felt Dawn's hand on her back, gentle and encouraging. She stood, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt slightly, as if she were standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. Then she steadied herself and walked toward the stage with the careful grace of someone crossing a frozen lake, unsure if the ice would hold. At the podium, clutching the Oscar, Meryl looked out at the sea of faces: actors she admired, directors she had worked with, industry executives who controlled the machinery of Hollywood, and tried to find words that felt true. The speech she had prepared was folded in her purse backstage, but she couldn't remember what it said. All she could think about was Mamie's tear-stained face and the note still tucked in her handbag. She thanked director Alan Pakula. She thanked her fellow actors. She thanked the Academy for the honor. But the speech she gave was not the speech that lived in her head, the one that had been forming during the long, sleepless nights of filming, during the mornings when she left before her children woke and the evenings when she returned after they had fallen asleep. The real speech went like this: "Thank you for recognizing this performance, but I need you to know that I played a mother who lost everything, and every night I went home to my own children and felt like a thief. I stole this time from them. I stole this grief from women who actually lived through the Holocaust, who actually stood on train platforms and made choices no human being should ever have to make. And now you're giving me a prize for it, and I don't know how to hold both things in my hands at once, the gold and the guilt, the achievement and the absence, the person you think I am and the person I'm afraid I'm becoming." But she didn't say that. Instead, she smiled, gracious and composed, said the expected things in the expected way, and walked off stage to more applause. Backstage, in the corridor where winners were shepherded from moment to moment, photographs, interviews, more photographs, a reporter with a microphone and bright teeth asked her how she felt. "Grateful," Meryl said, her voice steady and warm. "Deeply grateful." The reporter smiled, satisfied with the soundbite, and moved on to the next winner. Alone for a moment in the controlled chaos, Meryl reached into her purse and unfolded Mamie's note. The handwriting was crooked, the letters crowding together like children huddling for warmth. "Mommy, when are you coming home?" She stood there holding the Oscar in one hand and her daughter's note in the other, and she understood with sudden, painful clarity that these two things were connected, that one could not exist without the other, that every moment of professional glory had been purchased with moments stolen from her children's childhoods. The after-parties lasted until 3 in the morning. Meryl attended 2 of them because it was expected, because turning down these obligations would be seen as ungracious, because she had worked too hard and come too far to jeopardize her career by being difficult. She smiled for photos with other winners. She accepted congratulations from producers and directors who wanted to know what she would do next, what projects were in her pipeline, whether she was interested in their scripts. Everyone assumed she would ride this wave of success straight into more ambitious roles, bigger productions, historical epics, and literary adaptations that would cement her place in cinema history. No one asked if she wanted to. No one asked what it cost. When she finally made it home, the sky was already beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The apartment was dark and silent. Don had fallen asleep on the couch, still in his tuxedo, one arm thrown over his eyes. Meryl slipped off her heels, her feet were bleeding from hours of standing, and tiptoed down the hallway to the children's rooms. Mamie was curled beneath her blankets, one small fist clutching her stuffed rabbit, her face peaceful in sleep. Meryl knelt beside the bed, Oscar still in her hand, and watched her daughter breathe. The rise and fall of her small chest. The flutter of her eyelids as she dreamed of whatever 4-year-olds dream about, playgrounds, perhaps, or puppies, or mothers who don't leave. She thought about Sophie, standing on that train platform at Auschwitz, a Nazi officer forcing her to choose which of her children would be sent to the gas chamber. She thought about all the mothers in history who had been given impossible choices and had somehow survived them, had somehow continued living with the weight of those decisions. And she thought about herself, a woman who had everything the world told her to want, and yet felt like she was always choosing wrong, always sacrificing the thing that mattered most for the thing that mattered most to everyone else. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the floor beside her daughter's bed, until Mamie stirred and opened her eyes. "Mommy? I'm here, baby." Mamie blinked, confused, still half dreaming. "Did you win?" Meryl set the Oscar down on the floor, out of sight, and climbed into the narrow bed beside her daughter. "Yes," she whispered. "But it doesn't matter." Mamie smiled, sleepy and soft, and curled into her mother's arms. "Can you stay now?" "Yes," Meryl said, and this time it wasn't a lie. "I'm staying." She held her daughter close, still wearing her gown, and felt something shift inside her, not a decision, exactly, but a recognition. A understanding that she could not continue like this, that something fundamental had to change, that no amount of talent or discipline or willpower could bridge the gap between the life she was living and the life her children needed her to live. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, in that small room, time moved differently. Slower. Gentler. Meryl closed her eyes and let herself be just a mother. Not an actress. Not an Oscar winner. Not the finest performer of her generation. Just a woman who had come home. In the weeks that followed, Meryl made a decision that shocked the industry. She turned down 3 major film offers, prestigious projects with acclaimed directors, roles that would have cemented her status as the most powerful actress in Hollywood. She told her agent she was taking time off. 6 months, maybe a year. Maybe longer. The response was immediate and intense. Some called it career suicide. Others whispered that she was being difficult, ungrateful, wasting her prime years. There were quiet suggestions that she was having a breakdown, that the intensity of Sophie's choice had damaged her psychologically, that she needed help. But Meryl didn't care what they said. For the first time in years, she was choosing her children over her career, and it felt like coming up for air after swimming underwater for too long. She took Mamie to the park and pushed her on the swings. She made pancakes shaped like animals and let Henry help crack the eggs. She sat on the floor and built block towers that her youngest would gleefully knock down, and she laughed, really laughed, in a way she hadn't laughed in months. She went to parent-teacher conferences and learned that Mamie was excelling at reading but struggling with sharing. She attended school plays where her daughter had 3 lines and beamed with more pride than she had felt accepting any award. She went to birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese where no one asked her about movies or roles or what it was like to work with Robert De Niro. Don watched her during those months with a kind of quiet relief. He had worried, though he never said it aloud, that she might lose herself entirely in the machinery of fame, that the woman he had married would disappear and leave behind only the actress, only the public persona. But here she was, choosing to be ordinary. Choosing to be present. Choosing them. One afternoon, as they sat together in the kitchen while the children napped, Don asked her if she regretted it, the time away from work, the opportunities lost, the roles that would now go to other actresses. Meryl thought about it for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. "I don't regret the Oscar," she said finally. "I don't regret Sophie's choice. That role, it changed me. It taught me things about grief and loss and impossible choices that I needed to understand. But I regret how much it cost to get there. I regret the nights I wasn't here. I regret the mornings I left before they woke up and the evenings I came home after they were asleep. I regret the moments I missed because I was busy being someone else." She looked at him, and her eyes were clear. "I don't want to be the kind of mother who's always leaving. I don't want my children to remember me as someone they had to compete with a camera to see. I don't want them to grow up wondering if I loved them as much as I loved acting." Don reached across the table and took her hand. "You're a great mother," he said. "They know you love them." "I'm trying to be," Meryl said softly. "That's all I can do. Try. And right now, trying means being here." When Meryl eventually returned to acting, 18 months later, she did so on completely different terms. She chose projects that filmed in or near New York so she could come home every night. She negotiated schedules that allowed her to be present for bedtime and school drop-offs. She said no more often than she said yes, and she stopped apologizing for it. She made it clear to directors and producers that her children came first, that she would not sacrifice their childhoods for her career, that if they wanted her talent they would have to work around her family. The industry adjusted. Because Meryl Streep was undeniably brilliant, because her performances were worth the accommodation, they made it work. Directors learned to schedule her scenes consecutively. Producers learned to film in locations near her home. Studios learned that Meryl Streep would deliver extraordinary work, but only on her terms. And something unexpected happened. She became better at her craft, not worse. The time away had not diminished her talent, it had deepened it. She brought to her roles a groundedness, an emotional authenticity that came from living fully in her own life rather than always inhabiting someone else's. She played mothers with a truth that came from actually being present in her own children's lives. She played women with complexity and nuance because she understood, intimately, what it meant to contain multitudes, to hold opposing truths in tension, to be both powerful and vulnerable, both successful and struggling. Years later, when Mamie was grown and pursuing her own acting career, a journalist asked Meryl if she had any regrets about stepping back during the height of her fame. Meryl smiled, the same composed smile she had worn on that Oscar stage decades earlier, but this time it reached her eyes. This time it was real. "I have no regrets," she said. "I could have made 10 more movies in those years. I could have won more awards, worked with more prestigious directors, built an even bigger legacy. But I only get one chance to raise my children. The Oscars will always be there. They'll always be making movies. But childhood doesn't wait. Those years when they're small and they need you, you don't get those back." The reporter pressed further, leaning forward with that particular intensity journalists get when they sense something meaningful. "But don't you think you could have had both? Don't you think women today are told they can have it all?" Meryl paused, choosing her words carefully. This was a question she had thought about for decades, a question that defined an entire generation of women. "I think we can have both," she said slowly. "But not at the same time, and not without cost. Every choice we make means not choosing something else. That's not a failure of feminism or a limitation of women. That's just the truth of being human. We all have finite time and finite energy. The question isn't whether we can have it all, the question is what matters most right now, in this moment, with these specific people who need us." She thought about that night in 1983, standing backstage with gold in one hand and her daughter's note in the other, feeling torn between two versions of herself that seemed irreconcilable. "I won 2 Oscars before I was 40, Meryl continued. "But my proudest achievement is that my children never doubted I loved them more than any role I ever played. They never wondered if they were competing with my career for my attention. They know, that they come first." The interview ended, and Meryl drove home through familiar streets to a different apartment now, her children grown and scattered across the country pursuing their own dreams. But the lesson remained, embedded in who she had become. The Oscar from that night still sat on a shelf in her study, gleaming and golden, along with the others she had won over the years. But next to it, in a small frame, was a piece of paper, wrinkled and faded, with crooked handwriting that read, "Mommy, when are you coming home?" She had kept it all these years as a reminder. Not of what she had won, but of what truly mattered. Not of the applause that fades, but of the small voice that needed her. Not of the person Hollywood wanted her to be, but of the person she had chosen to become. Because in the end, the greatest performance of Meryl Streep's life wasn't captured on any screen. It wasn't analyzed by critics or celebrated at ceremonies. It was the quiet, daily choice to show up for the people who loved her not for her talent or her fame or her collection of awards, but simply because she was theirs. It was the decision to be fully present in ordinary moments, breakfast table conversations and bedtime stories and school pickups, even when the world was offering her extraordinary alternatives. And that, more than any award, more than any standing ovation, more than any place in cinema history, was the role she was born to play. The role that mattered most. The role that, unlike all the others, she could never delegate to someone else. The role of mother. Present, imperfect, and finally, blessedly, home. Retry.